Welcome to the Istio Networking community meeting. It's the second meeting of this year, but Happy New Year because I missed the first meeting and many good wishes for the year 2019. And on the agenda, we have 4 items today and maybe more to come. The first one, we have guests from the Policy and Telemetry Work Group to discuss an approach about exposing telemetry about virtual services and services and destination rules, right? Okay, and then we have Shannon to discuss a scalability issue. We have, I think, a follow-up on the locality load balancing from last week. I see something here. And I'm not sure exactly what is the last item, but I hope, Sebastian, you're here. So let's try to do, how about do you need more than 15 minutes?
No, it should be.
Okay, I guess it looks like a 15 minutes for each topic should be okay, unless we'll have more than that. Okay. All right, so.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, there's a sort of a long-standing request to provide some harmony between the networking side of the world and the telemetry side of the world. And one of the ways that people are interested in doing that is tracking which virtual services and which destination rules fired for an event, right? And so we just are looking for some way, and we're happy to do, we have resources to devote to implementation, but we just need to know what the right way of getting virtual service information and destination rule information exposed to the telemetry subsystem is. So that's why we bring it up here, and we're looking for input. And I know that there's been some comments in the doc. I know Sriram, you've commented. So basically, we're looking for guidance, and then
I think the key is that the virtual service part is easy. For the destination rule part, we can actually add the metadata to the cluster about which destination rule is actually being used. But then I think the resolution was that you have to change the proxy such that when the proxy is in the Mixer client, when it's actually about to add all the attributes, it checks the upstream cluster for that particular route. And from that cluster, it extracts the metadata attached to the cluster. That way, it becomes much more easier and more tractable.
Okay.
So that was basically, if you patch the Mixer client such that at runtime before adding sending the reports or whatever it is, it goes and within Envoy itself, it actually queries for the information about the cluster. Then, within that cluster, we can actually embed information about what destination routes are actually being used for that cluster inside a metadata block. And that way, the Mixer client could actually get all the information, and then it could send that information to Mixer. Okay. The alternative is actually to pre-compute everything within every route, but that actually gets very costly. And that was the final, I don't know, that we arrived at. It was that this is a much better approach, and you would get information about what destination rules are being used. The virtual service part has actually already been done, right? I think there was somebody from Red Hat Object, Gary Brown. He actually added information about, for every trace, there was this concept of a business operation, where that business operation represents the virtual service name for that trace. But then somebody came along and kind of undid the whole thing, saying that they needed the full host name and the default routes and so on and so forth. So, but if you resolve that, you actually have the information in every HTTP route in terms of which virtual services are actually used for that route.
Okay.
Is there a documentation somewhere? What metadata is used and what keys and?
Not metadata. The virtual. So this was you were there when you were doing the PR, right? Within the route there is a business. Within the route is a trace block which contains the operation name. And that operation name is either the default host name /star or the virtual service name that was actually used for that route.
Yes, but that's not sufficient because it's for tracing UI presentation. It's a different purpose. So we need something more that is like.
No, but isn't that what you want? The virtual service name that was used for that route, the name plus namespace.
Yes, we want UID. So it's a name plus namespace.
Right. We can fix that. actually. We can definitely like add namespace to that business operation so that it becomes you will have a unique way of identifying which virtual service it was.
And that's not what the tracing UI people want, though. They want short name. So I think it's a different purpose.
That we can talk to Gary Brown and see if he's, okay with like adding the name plus names, because that would, or alternatively, we can definitely add more metadata to every route to say which virtual service is actually being used, so that you can actually parse it out in the Mixer plugin, and that should not be an issue.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there any issue with just doing that and making it explicit?
Yeah, that's not an issue. I mean, it's just metadata that just gets moved around, so it's not an issue.
Right. So it sounds like that there's a reasonable approach here to use to add some metadata about the virtual service, and in the cluster metadata add the destination rule.
Yep.
So if everyone is okay with that, I'm fine with that too. And yeah. Okay. So
any other, like, let's see, maybe somebody has any comment on that.
Yeah, Costin here. Performance is critical. I mean, if we can implement it without breaking the caching and blowing up the size of the genetic config.
Yeah, so is the primary use case display, or is the primary use case policy?
The request came up related to telemetry, but I imagine at some point you could, I don't know what the
plus, I expect the names will probably be pretty stable, right?
What?
But the names would be pretty stable.
Oh, the names are stable. There's no caching issue here because the cluster is tied to the destination rule and not tied to every single proxy. So the cache just continues to work as it is. It will not affect the cache in any way. So the thing that actually affects the cache is our notion of like adding the UID in every HTTP route, and that kind of makes it hard for us to cache the whole, the generated configuration. This stuff does not have anything with respect to it. Names are stable. Oh,
okay.
We should make sure we include namespace.
Yes.
Speaking of things later on in this dialogue.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so if there are no more comments on this, we'll go to the second item. So Shannon, I think I've seen you here. So could you please, if you want to share, I have your document open, but if you want to share and go through it, please feel free to do so.
No, thank you. I don't need to share. I just have some follow-up questions to a thread that I've been conversing with Lewis and others about the work that we're doing to address scaling issues by filtering the config that is received by sidecars. I continue to be uncomfortable with the approach of tackling this problem by requiring app developers to declare their dependencies when it really seems like something that should fall out of a policy declaration. And it seems to me that this approach is being taken because we continue to assume a default allow all policy, when this would be addressed quite simply if we assumed deny all policy, in which case sidecars would receive no config until a security policy was declared. And whitelists are much easier to manage this blacklist. I understand that maybe the approach is being taken for backwards compatibility reasons, but I wonder if the group would consider that scalability as a feature was offered only when a default deny all mode was enabled.
So generally speaking, right, this discussion is about which side of the producer-consumer relationship is controlling or is most likely to control access, right?
Correct.
So
that's right. And in our experience, it's the producer.
Right. So if I attached, I don't know if you look in the agenda, I attached a link. So there was a proposal in the scoping, the 2 iterations, the scoping discussion about having services declare themselves as public or private, right? And there's a link to a GitHub issue basically refining that proposal to allow the service owner to declare the namespaces to which the service is exposed, right? So that's a producer-oriented whitelist of consumers.
That sounds reasonable.
That was discussed in the earlier iteration of the namespacing scope doc. And we hadn't yet validated whether we just needed public-private or whether we wanted that thing that was more refined. And it became fairly obvious that we needed the more refined thing.
I agree.
So that's now on the table for 1.1. That doesn't necessarily obviate the need for the consumer to have further refinement, right, of the default set of services that are exported to it. We still need Sidecar also in addition for layer 3 through layer 6 controls from the consumer's perspective, right? Because they still need to control the networking behavior in some cases.
Why?
Well, you have a variety of cases, right? So you have port-oriented protocol routing that they need to deal with. They need to use ports as aliases for stateful sets. The ability to...
Why is that a consumer concern?
If I can jump in here shortly, it's if someone is exporting and is allowing me to use a service doesn't mean I want to use it. So the fact that someone is exporting a service to me should not force my sidecar to get that configuration.
I don't think that's right. Until you import, you're not going to get the configuration. I think
right, but then we still have both APIs for you, so that the producer gets this, right. So you have both people able to specify a whitelist, right, and the consumer gets the intersection of the 2 whitelists.
Exactly. If someone is exporting to everyone, doesn't mean everyone needs to get that configuration.
Right. That's what I think what Shannon wants.
Why does the consumer care? Like the consumer shouldn't even know what configuration the sidecar has.
Consumer cares where he imports from, because if 2 different names by 2 different tenants export the same
I
service,
disagree. It's an implementation detail of what config the consumer side sidecar has.
Well, the consumer, if producers are not well behaved, right, which is possible, then the consumer still needs to be able to control, right?
And a lot of people will export star. I mean, that's a common behavior. Your service has your own authentication. Very few people will maintain a exact list of what namespaces are going to import it.
Right.
You're suggesting that a misbehaved producer might say that their service should be available to everyone.
Yes.
Yep.
Right, which is the default behavior in Kubernetes today, right?
Right. Yeah, basically the consumer wants to still be able to indicate which are the services they want to import from, right? That's important too.
The alternative is, at least this is how it works in Cloud Foundry, that policy is not possible. You do not allow producers to expose their service to everyone.
Right, so that's true in Cloud Foundry and not true in Kubernetes.
But even if we do that...
So in a multi-tenant environment, it makes sense.
Right, so in
an environment where every one of 10,000 app development teams get their own cluster, maybe that makes sense, putting aside the maintenance overhead nightmare.
But that's a nightmare. You cannot put aside the nightmare.
But in the environments, on-premise enterprise environments, where that is a problem, then it makes more sense to prevent producers from exposing their service to everyone.
Right, so Kubernetes doesn't have a default prevent mechanism.
But Istio could.
Istio could, right? And so we're trying to at least make that possible in the API in the Sidecar API. Well, one of the goals around the eventual namespace isolation of the changes is to allow the administrator to configure what the default behavior is, where you want either the default behavior from the consumer side to be import everything that's exported to me, import nothing by default, or import only my namespace by default. Right, those are the three viable options. Right, and Shannon, in the Cloud Foundry world, the namespace, or I've forgotten the Cloud Foundry equivalent, would be import my namespace only by default, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to get to the point where we have a configuration mechanism where an admin could say, look, the default behavior of the mesh in namespaces where that behavior is not overridden is this, right? Where it's import namespace only.
But wouldn't that be the simplest path to scalability, as opposed to what seems like this workaround of putting the onus on every consumer? I mean, I'm imagining how an operator is going to, cluster operator is going to take advantage of this feature to accomplish scale. They have to go out and tell every app development team using the cluster to now specify what their dependencies are in order to accomplish that.
We have customers who are doing that and want to do that explicitly. That is part of their business process.
And we already do that for external services. All egress needs to be explicitly defined by the consumer.
But imagine that, so it seems to me that you've got different use cases. There is the auditability use case of an operator or security team who wants to know what the dependencies are of every workload. That is not a scalability concern. You also have the operator who wants to support many development teams.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that those could be accomplished in different ways. The strategy, it seems, that's being taken to accomplish scalability is really more appropriately addressing the auditability use case, and that it would be, in my opinion, a more effective approach to scalability to assume a denial policy.
So
rather than
the issue is we can't do that by default, right? So no matter what, we're going to any transition we make in behavior, we're going to have to go through a migration path, right?
That's fine. I'm suggesting that scalability, that you don't get scalability by default. If you want scalability, you opt into a denial policy.
I think we already do that. I mean,
no, but that's easy. That definitely we already have a global outbound traffic policy, which is either local registry only.
It's the wrong API for this.
Well,
right? We can't hijack APIs and change their semantics, right? So
no, not hijacking. We also have the semantic where in the sidecar, if you don't specify egress, we default to local namespace only, which can also be
that means you have to go and put sidecar in every namespace, which is fine, but that's probably not the right user experience, right? If you want to have a global denial policy, there should be one resource that is by default representing a global denial. And then if you want to change that on a namespace by namespace basis, you do that on a namespace by namespace basis, right?
Sure. Yes. That would mean we need to have a default sidecar thing for the global,
yes.
And that would have to have a, not just an array, but a Boolean flag which says deny all or accept these namespace.
Right. So the intent is we'll probably not get that in 1.1, but we might get it in 1.2.
So one comment I meant to make here, even if we,
but until then, these guys are gonna still be running with the whole bigger thing, which means that was I guess that is the point that until we could probably tackle that in 1.2 as a separate API, but until then we could still provide them with some where we currently there's actually no way even in an egress block to specify I don't want to import anything. It's just always blank. I mean, blank implies it's just always local namespace. It can probably be in a different way where we say with a tag or whatever.
We do have a way in an egress block to say only import my namespace though.
Right, but we don't have a way to import nothing.
Right, but it's probably tolerable to say just import namespace is sufficient, right? As a way to scope down, right?
So that's the question to Shannon. Is that sufficient? Is it sufficient to simply say import local namespace only by default? Will that work?
To be honest, it sounds right, but I don't know the implications of it.
I don't know if it'll meet our scaling requirements.
Services within the local same CF space and not the org or anything else.
Yeah.
Define as a namespace in CF.
We sometimes have we have spaces that have hundreds, thousands of applications in them. So you might still hit problems where you're getting a lot of service entries.
So Sriram, there's also a way, right? It's not ideal, but you can say only import from the current namespace and import basically an unresolvable service name, right? Which means you would get nothing.
But we're talking about
I think Costin has been trying to pitch in, so let's give him a chance.
Sorry, I was going to say, first of all, we are discussing about export, not import. I mean, export policies, I think, the primary concern here.
Yeah.
No, I think he's talking about the import policies, because for him it's like, you don't.
No, but we started with discussing about export. I mean, if we can implement, I mean, how do we have producer controls this? And
right, so we have, it is in scope for 1.1 to have producer controls over service scope. So that's going to get done, right, which I think meets your requirement. I think Shannon was pushing back on whether the other part was needed, and we're asserting that we think we need both because we have customers who want that.
And we need not only for scalability. I mean, we need it because consumers want to have control over what they import for security reasons, for many other reasons. I mean,
that's the
okay. That's fine. That's fair. I just want to make sure that that scalability can be achieved without requiring configuration of this import.
Right. So yes, if producer definitions are sufficient to achieve scalability.
But that basically means all those hundreds of thousands of apps will have to have their producer definitions, which says the service is only exported to. They could only even specify exported to dot namespace. They can't specify export to nobody.
No, they can export to specific namespaces, a list of namespaces. We cannot achieve scalability if we have star, export to star. So public is...
That's not the discussion. The discussion is that I want to have a default none ingress.
We cannot default none. That's really, I mean, we cannot do an option to export to
none. So Sriram, we have an okay way to achieve that in 1.1.
Yes, but I think his point is for every CF space or every CF namespace equivalent, this would actually require all the developers to go and write that Sidecar API to specify a dummy thing.
For export, for sure. I mean, they need to deploy the export.
Import a dummy Sidecar API which imports from a non-existent place, so as to create a zero.
Right. So we can give them a global default mechanism.
Yeah.
What I was talking about, we do a global default, which basically says either local namespace only or nothing, and that default.
We can do that.
Yeah, we can find a way to make that work.
But the default, I mean, the out-of-box default should be namespace because that's a command.
Sorry, what's that, John?
Would it help if there was a tool that could take a look at Prometheus, tell you what you talked to, and write this document for you? And you could just...
No, but this is before the fact. You can't do it after the fact because the whole system has to start first, and then you have to have stuff flowing the Prometheus.
Right. So you have this low performance. You run this tool with Istio control that says, here's the policy you should have had. Then you apply that policy. Then you get the performance you want.
Yeah, so there are certainly customers I've talked to who are looking at automating this based on that reserved traffic, but there are classes of customers who simply cannot
do that in the beginning.
Have the slow behavior from the beginning because it just literally won't work.
Yeah.
Right, they're at that scale. Okay, so it sounds like we need to resolve a way to give the default behavior. You're fine with the
It doesn't have to be a default behavior. I guess maybe I'm misinterpreting what you mean by that. But if you can opt into a mode where the sidecars only receive config for the same namespace, that sounds fine.
Yeah, so the Sidecar API will give you that.
That would give you that.
And the global flag.
Sidecar API that would basically only create the local namespace only. The problem is that, as Gabe pointed out, I've definitely seen CF namespaces, which is a namespace which has like 1,000+ services, and that by itself is actually like very bad. So in those cases, you still need an option to turn it off and say no until endless explicitly specified.
We can definitely add this option, Sriram.
So maybe it's an additional global option, which is namespace or nothing.
Nothing.
Yes. And we already have a mechanism for that because the outbound traffic policy, we have a mechanism which basically says registry only or any service, and we can tack onto that as well.
Right. So the thing here, Shannon, we're trying not to use flags, right? We're trying to use our APIs to define these behaviors, right, for default. So the general trend of solution in this space is to say there's a kind of a root namespace, right? That's part of the control plane under the administrator control, where a default sidecar would live that controls the behavior, right, of namespaces that didn't define their own sidecar, right? And then that sidecar would say either I'm importing everything, I'm importing only the namespace, right, or whatever it needs to do by default. And then the namespace could override it.
So is that namespace the same as Istio system?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be specifically Istio system, but it's something that the administrator own and not the tenant.
Okay.
I think I understand the user experience. The user experience you're describing would be that a cluster operator or admin would write a YAML file which described the default configuration for all sidecars, and that config would be applied to a namespace that only they have access to.
Yes.
Whether that namespace actually has workloads or not is irrelevant. Whether it even has physical sidecars deployed is irrelevant.
Yeah, totally irrelevant.
It's simply an API resource that acts as the default behavior for all other sidecars if they aren't specifically defined.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the sidecar CRD will live then in that namespace.
You create a sidecar CRD in that namespace, and it becomes the default for any namespace that does not have its own explicit sidecar.
Gabe, does that sound reasonable to you too?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable for the short term for us to just import from the local namespace, or if we really need to lock it down, like do the hack where we create an import of a non-existing thing, and then that causes us to not import anything.
Yeah. I have heard from customers that that our allow all workloads within the same namespace to talk to one another is a problem for them. That they would prefer to have no workloads even within the namespace talk to one another, and that requires an explicit policy. So having, I understand it comes with additional cost, but having the option to lock it down even further would be valuable.
Yeah, and I think we can provide that. Like Cloud Foundry is generating these configs, so the Cloud Foundry UX can just be that Boolean switch, and we can choose which of these two things to put into the default sidecar or the per space sidecar. Considering
that CF is currently generating these configs, anything is potentially possible. But if we could provide the approach that we've been discussing, it not only makes our integration easier, but in a possible future where we expose some portion of the Istio API such that there is a CF user experience which involves writing Istio YAML files, we're able to provide the most appropriate user experience. And I think that means that in general, consumers shouldn't have to declare their dependencies in order for the platform operator's scalability concerns.
So yeah, that effect would be achievable, right, with the combination of export to and kind of operator control over default sidecar behavior or namespace operator control for override.
Fantastic.
And
Thank
on
you.
demand. And
on demand when scale goes absolutely crazy. Just because this is entirely on topic, I put another item in the agenda about DestinationRule, because DestinationRule has a similar scoping problem in the current 1.0 implementation. And we're proposing to treat resolving that issue mostly as a bug, because right now I can create a destination rule in one namespace and have it have a side effect on the behavior of traffic in another namespace without the other namespace knowing about it. And so the bug proposes a hierarchical resolution of destination rule based on a destination rule in the namespace that's referring to a service would take priority over a destination rule defined in the namespace that defined the service. And then if there was, again, a similar kind of root configuration namespace, then it would be possible to resolve a destination rule in that namespace using the standard host-based destination rule matching. And this
great.
Yeah, so this is all aligned with that general principle of let's make namespaces more tenant-like. Let's not have cross namespace side effects. And if we need to have global defaults, then that is well defined and belongs to a well-known kind of cluster operator controlled namespace.
So question on this, so the destination rule along with the Sidecar API, wouldn't that allow me to actually control through the Sidecar API on what destination I want my services to talk to?
It controls the service that you select, but unfortunately that doesn't control destination rule resolution.
But it helps me control, I guess, the visibility of my services. Like in your case, if
right,
I
again,
don't,
that's totally orthogonal to how destination rule resolution works today. Right, so Sidecar and Gateway plus the scoping stuff we just described resolve service visibility and service consumption.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, destination rule is an orthogonal kind of hierarchical policy that applies to services after they've been resolved. And today, it has a global fallback.
So you're saying the destination rule can point to the services, even though my Sidecar API configuration doesn't allow the services to be reached?
Yes, if you scroll down a little bit.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Sharing,
that's not very intuitive.
Yeah, so I gave an example here, right, where I have a namespace. Just go up the top.
Here, this one's steps to
reproduce, right?
Okay.
You create a service entry in the namespace A, you create a destination rule that selects it, right, but you used wildcard. Then you refer to it in a virtual service in another namespace. Okay, now the namespace B will use the destination rule defined in A. And then I go create a third namespace with a more specific destination rule match for the host name, and it wins.
So in terms of this, right, I mean, are we trying to tackle the problem where the Sidecar resource is not present, or is it the case where when the Sidecar resource is present, this problem exists?
Well, in the case where Sidecar is present, we can change the semantics to not allow this craziness, which I think we've already agreed on.
Well, yes,
but we still have the default behavior when people aren't defining sidecars, right? And we don't want that to be massively different from the behavior when they do. And the behavior as currently implemented in 1.0, right, is dangerous.
And it's also
virtual services and destination rules for.
Right, Sriram is right. There's a similar kind of scoping issue with virtual service, right, which we would also like to resolve. I specifically just opened this bug up about destination rule. I can open up another one about virtual service. At least with Sidecar and Gateway, there is some constraint over virtual service resolution, right? You have to opt into namespaces having side effects, right? If I refer to a virtual service in a specific namespace, then it's impossible for another namespace to define something and have it affect my behavior.
The same applies to destination rule as well. So when you import a particular namespace, only the destination rules and virtual services in that namespace get imported, and you cannot import anything from any other namespace. So the problem will not exist with the Sidecar API. It only exists without the Sidecar API.
Right. Why can't we use that solution so that it's consistent too? I mean, if they don't have the Sidecar API, they should just write the config.
We also have to fix this for Gateway.
Well,
right.
When we fix for the gateway, once again, we are going to be specifying, or we are going to ask people to specify namespace.
Right, but there's no new API to act as a trigger for changing the behavior.
Right, but there's a newer way of specifying the same host. If they specify,
right, but that's such a syntactically similar, and in fact they're not required to do it, that you would have very trivial changes in API usage causing shifts without documenting it. That's not a good idea.
It sounds to me like this is really just trying to fix a bug with the default behavior in a simple way. And I think it just, all you've done is you've added this intermediate step of saying, instead of just randomly go to everything, go to the where the thing's defined first. And then you've sort of added this convenient thing to say, let's never look down the whole list. And if you set this administrator root thing, then you don't bother even looking at the other sort of things. I think the only change is, this is a bug fix if you just say the default, instead of being Istio system, the default is to go back to the old behavior of look everywhere. So you've kind of said the administrator has to set this thing to get away from the bug completely. but you're going to sort of probably get rid of the bug in those cases just by doing a step 2, right?
Right. I think the only issue is if we treat it as a bug and we fix it, it can affect people, right? Some people might have inadvertently been depending on the behavior.
Yeah, but they've got a broken system.
Yeah, they have a broken system, I think. Right, so I don't think we need to ship full back to the old behavior.
Oh, I see. So you don't think, yeah. So once you put this, yeah, but if,
I mean, we have to put in the release notes and let people know, look, there was a bug.
There's a hole here that you should know about.
Yeah. Don't upgrade until you have fixed your config. Right?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
So there is like a general problem with the destination rule and subsets that
a separate, but yes, somewhat related issue.
Exactly. So the thing is, in Kubernetes by default, you can only select pods in the same namespace as the service.
Well,
right.
There are many other API issues. I just want to deal with this one because this is blocking for 1.1.
Okay, so we need to like sort of take an action like for the next release to clarify how the selection of subset happens.
Yeah,
whether it's cross
a separate
namespaces or within namespace as well.
Yeah, that's a separate API discussion. But this specifically is blocking 1.1. I think Sriram is going to pay me a visit here this afternoon because he's on the cloudy and wet West Coast, so he and I can take this up. But if people can take a look at this and provide their feedback on the bug, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
And it's very aligned with the previous discussion we just had.
So are you looking also for somebody to fix this, like for a volunteer on the code?
Know the right way to fix this first, and then
Sriram and I will talk about that.
Okay. Yeah. We can probably move to the next topic. So that was like a topic, Louis, that you added here. So you went ahead of Liam, and also like Sebastian has a topic. So we need to see how we manage to cover both.
I apologize for jumping the queue. It's just because it was 1.1.
Yeah, it's exactly. So just to explain, like it's like normally first in, first out, but if there is like a bug blocking the release or something, we give it some time in the meeting, which was the case here. Okay, so I guess we can move to the locality load balancing. Liam and Zhonggu.
Yeah, so I'm the only person here. My co-author's in China, so he's very asleep by now. So this is basically I was looking at ZoneOS separately, and my co-author was looking at locality weighted load balancing separately and has some API implementation of that. And this is the bringing of those together. Where the TLDR of the ZoneAware side, which is the side I'm familiar with, is basically using priorities within localities. That gives us the behavior we want. It's consistent with the locality weighted stuff. Just generally looking for feedback on the ZoneAware side of things. I know I've had discussions with people basically around the API for the locality side of things. But these can be done separately. They use the same underlying, locality information. It's purely a priority versus weighting thing. The default for when you turn on locality is going to be priority 0 for everything that's within the same locality, and then priority 1 for everything else. That's going to be a config flag because there will be some extra computation in pilot on EDS at that point. I need to probably sync up with Costin offline at some point. It's probably not worth doing it in the networking group about how the EDS cache is going to work with the Sidecar stuff and kind of the stability of it, and whether or not I can go ahead and implement it right now, or whether or not it's going to require the EDS for the Sidecar scoping stuff to be done and then build it on top of that.
I just heard Louis say that we'd prefer to use global API objects instead of flags, and I just heard you say something about flags. I'm curious if we should try to resolve that.
So by that I mean a global config, basically.
Okay, cool.
That you would have to opt into because, again, like I said, we need to do some computation on the way out of EDS to work out which localities are local to the requesting envoy, basically. So, I mean, we don't necessarily have to discuss anything here. It was more of a bring it to people's attention, and I need to probably have a chat with Costin offline about this, about the EDS cache and how it all is going to work going forwards.
David, do you have any input on that, or?
I mean, it sounds like you folks are just. I mean, you're following the design that we had discussed in a separate thread, where everything's going to be expressed through localities and priorities. That sounds fine. I mean, when you talk about zone aware, are you actually talking about like Envoy zone aware mechanism, or just the zonal aspect of locality?
So we're gonna basically what we're doing is we're explicitly not using zone aware, and we will explicitly call it not zone aware because that will be confusing.
Yeah.
But basically, we're setting localities for everything. By default, Kube will use things like the node annotations for those type of things to set the localities, and then we're going to prioritize local ones for the kind of cluster-wide locality stuff. And then if you want to override specific services, that's where the locality weighting comes in. At that point, we'll flatten the priority back to 0, and we'll purely use weighting at that point. So the locality weighting uses Envoy's locality weighting. The zone aware, in quote marks, uses priorities, basically. And it definitely will not be called zone aware because for that exact reason.
Well, I mean, will we end up in a situation where you want to combine the weighting and priorities?
Potentially. We haven't designed for that yet, but that's something that can be extended to, I guess. It gets quite complex at that point.
I know. I mean, yeah.
We would probably have to have some serious API design on how we would go about exposing that, because that's quite complicated. But the idea was to have a simple use case for customers that basically want to say, if it's in the same locality, just keep it in the same locality for me. That could also be extended to this kind of override for locality weighting.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is sort of most of the design of Envoy's locality and priority structure is driven actually by an externalization of Google's internal load balancing, which we use. So I guess, but we found all of these combinations to be useful. And we actually make use of both weighting and priorities there. I mean, priorities are really used for the situation where you lose all the healthy hosts or a very large percentage of healthy hosts in a given priority, and you want to fall over to a completely different set of locality weightings as the next step in your picking, which is a bit different than I hear that folks are interested in using priorities in the Istio context, where, at least based on this thread that we were on, people wanted an immediate repick at the next priority if there's any failure at the and then the current locality / priority. Is that correct, or?
Well, I guess that's a fuzzy line, because I mean, define how do you fail over. I mean, today we just falling back to like outlier detection, and then saying that like if outlier detection says none of the endpoints in the local priority are like top priority are.
Yeah, but I pointed you these. There's actually like a priority. I think it's called the priority retry predicate or something like that. You can actually write a plugin for Envoy now, which basically tells it, after it's seen that first failure, even before outlier detection kicks in, when I do my next pick, I should only look at P1 instead of P0.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would probably be a user configurable thing, because I don't think it's wise to always fall back to a different zone just because one endpoint or local zone fails.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see a range of customers, some of whom want 2 tries in my local zone, and my last try to be up the priority list.
Yeah. I mean, if you make this like a WebAssembly plugin, they can just put whatever policy they want. It's just another extension point.
Right. So I think, if a policy where I want 5 retries and I have 3 priorities.
Yeah.
How would you process it? Do I do the first 3 tries in P0, the next try in P1, and the last try in P2?
I mean, this is purely policy at this point, and it's just a question of like, you can write this as code today as an extension. How can we externalize this? Would we just write a proto which captures this in different permutations, or would they actually write some dynamic thing which did this? I mean, it probably depends on how sophisticated the customer is, right, at the end of the day.
I mean, mostly we want to steer customers to the baked-in ones.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, we're going to take a look at the predicates and see if we can do what we want with the retry predicates. Liam, you've looked at that stuff, right? The retry policy predicates.
I've not had a chance to that.
I think it was
That's really new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is added by, I think, Square. Someone at Square. Snow Peterson.
Yeah.
Right. So now there are these kind of baked-in policies that when a retry occurs, it interacts with this endpoint selection mechanism in deterministic ways.
Right.
So maybe you should take a look at that stuff and, in particular, add a link to it in your doc.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. First I've heard of it. Would love to see a link.
Yeah. Put a link somewhere in the meeting notes.
I'll put a link in the docs.
Yeah. I only read it this week too, but it provides a framework for doing what we want here, I think.
Yeah. I think that we are going to be keying off locality. It's just kind of, we can layer on different stuff at different points, I think.
So there's obviously we're using DestinationRule as the API vehicle for this right now.
Yes.
Which comes with its baggage, in particular the lack of inheritance, right?
Yeah. Has inheritance. Oh, you mean DestinationRule does have inheritance, right?
DestinationRule does not have inheritance, it has override.
Well, yeah, we have merging as well, yes.
No, we don't.
We do have merging. I added it a while ago. We can merge destination.
When did you add that, Sriram? Because we have some open bugs that people are asking about where I don't think we have merging.
We had it before.
We have subsets merge with their parent.
Yes, that's what I meant. That's automatically adding like the TLS, the traffic policies. If you specify the auth policy, for example, the TLS thing for the global level, then a destination rule for a local name, like, on a more specific destination rule would effectively inherit that unless it's actually overriding it.
Really? When did that change?
That was done before 1.0, because that's when people were complaining that, like, they would set the global.
Can you send me a link to that? Because I clearly missed that part. Anyway, yes. So this would have the same. We need to make sure we understand what we want the inheritance or override semantics for this to be, because it's a lot of state, right? Declaring all the zones.
So with this one, with the second half, yes. The first half of the priority on locality, it doesn't require like any user. It basically tells requires the user to opt in. Okay. The second half requires that
even like the automatic failover stuff. I mean, the load distribution is like you specify that in one time, like a global destination rule, and that part would probably get inherited. That's why I was okay with it doing in the destination rule.
Okay, yeah. I mean, 2-tier doesn't require a declaration, right? It's either your zone or it's not your zone.
Yes, no, it does not.
But
it doesn't even need to know like what the zones are going to be ahead of time, right? Yeah. It pulls information from Q and does it automatically.
Yeah, that would work pretty well in combination with least latency style selection mechanisms.
Does that exist or not? Does the least
not today? Right.
Okay. I was going to say.
There's no load balancing policy of
least latency. No, because we don't measure that. We have least load, and which is not quite the same thing. Yeah. I mean, it may actually.
We have least latency internally, right? I believe.
We may. I mean, we have a lot of.
But it's based on a priori knowledge of topology, I think.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I mean, if you're talking about like latency due to wire delay or latency due to actual load, I mean, or is it some combination of the two? That this is a real-time measured thing, or?
I was just talking about wire latency.
Okay. And you can just express that through the locality concept, right? But you're worried about like having to re-express it.
Well, then it's then we have many tiers, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to explicitly declare them.
Yeah. No.
And how do you do that, and what's the API gesture? Right?
We don't have anything like that today. Yeah, that's an interesting design.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So
yes, we can clearly ship 2-tier, but if we want to go beyond that or do something else, we're gonna have to do some more work.
Okay. That's fine. I will talk to Zongzu about that, and because he's driving the API design stuff, so we can have separate discussions on that. But if we're happy to do the 2-tier one, I do need to chat with Costin about that. But other than that, I think we're good.
All right.
Okay, so let's give everybody a chance to review that and follow up maybe in the next meeting, because we're not giving the promised 20 minutes to Sebastian for the last item. Sebastian, are you still with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to run a little late, by the way.
Yeah, definitely. If
need more
hopefully
time.
people can stay around.
Okay, so hey, my name is Sebastian. I'm working from Reddit on an open source project called QVir. The project's allowed to run a virtual machine workload on top of Kubernetes. And I create I think 2 months ago, and I didn't get any review or something. So I just want to point it out here, the APR that's so when we create a VM inside the pod, we create a tap interface inside the pod, and we are going to allow this interface to be as an internal interface to the Envoy itself. So my PR just adds some rules to the IP tables bash script that is running as an init container before the proxy comes up. And just configure a couple of rules there to allow a specific interface to be as internal one and not as external traffic direction.
Okay.
Okay, it's okay. So
for network devices.
Yeah. So there are quite a few files being changed, I see. So I think we will need time to review that. And I think for now you need an okay to test, right?
Yeah, I think so. About the changes, most of them is just the auto-generated YAML files that you have for the tests. I only change the bash script and one more file that introduce a new variable, the -r, to tell what is the interfaces that you want them to be internal one. That's it.
If I understand it correctly, are you taking stuff from the how does the KubeVirt work when it's up the networking namespace? The VM will have its internal network interfaces, which is not something that you can touch. But then you would have to set up this whole redirect stuff for the VirtIO interface that the VM is provided, right? And that is where you'd set up the in and out routing.
Yeah, exactly. So how we have a few different type of connection to virtual machines. One of them is SROV, and this one is out of the scope here because the pod namespace doesn't even see the interface. But we also have the VirtIO option, and we connect it to a Linux bridge in the pod namespace, and then we just use Masquerade to all the.
In that case, that you still have a network namespace which runs the entire VM, right?
Yeah, you have the pod namespace, and inside of it, we are running a QMO process, and the VM is there.
Right. So what I'm asking is that in that case, and the way that our IP table rules are set up is such that it just simply intercepts all traffic from all interfaces in the network namespace and routes it through Envoy and vice versa. So why would you need to modify that if the VM is actually running a network namespace and you're setting up the rules in such a way that all traffic that enters and leaves this network namespace will go through Envoy?
Yes. So the main problem is when with the traffic that is going out from the VM, when the traffic is going out, it will hit the VNet 0 on the pod interface, and then Envoy will try that as an outgoing connection and will try to redirect it.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I see the one. Yeah, okay, that's the. Yeah, okay.
That's the main change.
Should we recommend
to the CNI work early on?
No, that doesn't work. I mean, this is a classic the virtual machine stuff, which is where the inbound traffic into a VM will appear as an outbound traffic and vice versa in some way. So the traffic that exits a VM will sort of appear as an inbound traffic to Envoy, which is not the right way to look at it. It's actually like an outbound traffic out of the pod network namespace. And what
exactly.
Actually, like, this is a very classic thing that happens with Zen, like in a KVM and and so on and so forth. So when you set up the IP table rules, you have to take into account that and modify it accordingly. This is the same, even if you use CNI, you would still have to do the same thing. It doesn't make any change. It does not actually make any difference.
It was like because normal IP table rules might vanish at some point in time when the CNI was like alpha, beta, and then product. And at some point in time, the init container will go away.
CNI is running the same IP table rules, and so his point is that like whether you run it to CNI or you run it to init container, you still have to run the exact same change that he has, which says only take the internal interfaces and not.
True, but he now implements feature on a die away. That's like
right. The Palo Alto guys were looking at that, right?
So no, the way they were looking at it was like their CNI was they want to inject different like firewalls and so on in the path. So, but their CNI was
right, but they wanted to do full Ethernet capture, so they were going to inject.
Yes, but that Ethernet capture is on the host, whereas this one is actually within the same networking namespace where it's network namespace to the Ethernet interface on the host. They would have wanted to introduce additional interfaces in the path so that they can run it through their firewalls and so on. Whereas in this case, this is actually a very classic thing where the kernel creates a virtual network interface in some way, and the traffic that leaves the VM would come into the interface, but for any process that's on the host, like even within the same network namespace, example Envoy here, it would look as though it's like inbound traffic into the interface. So that's how it was
yeah, exactly. And,
we'll definitely take a look at it.
Sorry, this is John. I haven't looked at the PR. This is the first time I'm seeing it. But I mean, I agree that the problem is generic, but I'm wondering if it might be easier to solve in the CNI. So we should look at how this could be done in the CNI as well and see if it's quite straightforward to do it there.
Yeah, I think overall, right, we want the CNI plugin to be able to set up these types of things on people's behalf. If it's whether you're running a VM or a container, right? There's a variety of different kind of network configurations that CNI could set up for you, and the setup of all of those should probably be pretty well encapsulated. So we should probably look to merge, right, this capability down into the CNI handler. But we don't have to block it. We don't have to block it in.
That was kind of what I was thinking, Louis. That we could. I mean, we don't need to block this, but we could look at adding this to the CNI, see how it merges there.
Justin?
Yeah, it will definitely need to be merged into CNI and maybe unmerge it, basically have separate IP table scripts for different profiles because it's a mess now with T-proxy and redirect and other things. We may need to clean it up before we, and definitely CNI will be another use case when we have different namespaces.
Yeah, okay.
I'll take a look at the PR.
Okay. Yeah, and I know some folks in Kubernetes land who'll probably want to look at this too. And it would be good to know how this works with existing CNI solutions. Like, I don't know, Sebastian, have you tried this with, Calico installed or some other CNI?
So the problem is not the CNI because we are running inside the pod and the CNI working on the host level. So it configures everything and create a namespace for the pod.
Okay.
And then KubeVirt works on the IP tables and everything inside the pod and not on the host level.
Right. Okay. So do you have net admin issues? Like
yes. Yes. We have a network capability in our Virt launcher pod. That's the main purpose of it is configure the network, configure the volumes and everything, and start the QMO process.
And that doesn't run as a daemon set or anything like that right now.
No, every pod from our perspective is a VM. We have a daemon set to control other things, but from the VM perspective, every pod that we have, it's one VM.
Okay. Okay. Well, it sounds super interesting. We're getting tossed out of our room. So
yeah, that's a new thing. I think somebody got the room over lunch. So I'm sorry, John, we won't be able to address that question. But I suggest, like there's a question on the chat. So I really suggest trying that via discuss.istio.io. Yeah, exactly. There is no more mailing list, but there is a website called discuss.istio.io. It looks a bit like Stack Overflow. It's based on this course. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We have to leave, unfortunately, because we lost our room. So I can. Thank you, and see you next time.